Hello, everyone. We are live, and welcome to the first episode of the Urban Blueprint, a podcast created by the UVic Real Estate Club to help educate students about the real estate industry. I'm your host, Aiden. I'm very, very excited to welcome our first ever guest to the show tonight. They're grateful enough to dedicate their time to join us, and we can't thank them enough. Please welcome to the show Matt and Jeremy from the Victoria Council. Thank you very much for being here, guys.
Hey,
thank you for having us.
Thanks for coming out, all you guys. 100 people in the crowd. Great. Packed house.
First podcast episode. We're really stoked to be on it.
Absolutely. We really appreciate it. So I really just want to start with your guys' backgrounds. Where are you from? How did you end up in Victoria politics?
Sure, I'll start. So where I'm from is the South Okanagan, small town there. I moved to Victoria to go to UVic 20 years ago. So I was a UVic student right in this building for many years. I have a degree in English literature and I have a master's degree in political science. So I focused at the time on environmental politics and agriculture politics in British Columbia. That led me into community building. So I got into neighborhood associations, trying to activate community, more events, music, whatnot. And from there, once I had kids, I realized the city's really not set up for kids, not set up well for young families. And a lot of that was getting into the urbanism and housing discussion, how we are not building enough housing for young families. We're not building safe streets, walkable streets for kids and youth. And I think there's a whole global movement around that kind of thing happening right now. And I kind of got caught up in that stream of thinking, and it's a lot of really exciting people discovering the same stuff. And that led me maybe to meeting Jeremy somewhere along the line, what we could talk about. We both ran for council. I'm got elected last October 2022. So I've been a city councilor for 12 months, and I'm learning a lot right now about that process, which we'll probably talk about. But that's my kind of quick story.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you. And yourself?
So I was born and raised in the U.S. in Seattle, and went and got my PhD, my master's and PhD from Johns Hopkins in history. I have a PhD in history, in political, environmental history, history of science, and I got a job at the age of 27 at the University of Alberta, and I immigrated to Canada, went from a work permit to a permanent residency up to citizen. And then after teaching there for a number of years, I moved out here, changed my life, got involved as a small business owner, then got back into academia and have been an adjunct in environmental studies here at UVic since 2015. So I usually teach 1, 2, 3, sometimes 4 courses a year. And then started working also as a climate policymaker for the province. So I was in the Climate Action Secretariat. I have a lot of interest in climate action, sustainable urbanism. And like Matt, I got involved in my community association, although I had a very different experience in my community association than Matt had in his. And that is what got city council onto my radar. So I ran for city council, as did Matt last year. And I also ran to be a CRD director. So I am a city councilor and CRD director. And just last week, I became the vice chair of the Capital Regional Housing Corporation, which is the nonprofit housing provider here it's a corporation that's owned wholly by the CRD. So I've plumbed the depths of housing policy, both market and non-market, and just flying by the seat of our pants every day. Every day is an adventure in this job.
Yeah, I bet it sounds like it. So about the job, for someone who doesn't know what exactly the Victoria City Council does or what responsibilities you guys have, what would be a basic brief explanation you guys could give?
That's a hard thing to summarize briefly. I mean, I think a lot of it does come back.
As long as you want, as long as you need.
Well, maybe I'll start with one side, which a lot of it is land use. So we are responsible for approving policies around land use and approving land use decisions around buildings, housing, design, like the overall community plan. So I would say at least 50% of our job is looking at development applications, considering how they align with policies that the city meets, and either approving them or denying them. I've found that to be an incredibly exciting part of the job because I think the city's growing, and as we go, we talk about intentionally transforming the city. So we're helping design the city through the construction of new restaurants, housing, villages, and these type of things. So I would say that's about 50% of our job, and maybe you can. What's the other 50%?
Scheming. I mean, I would say my brain moves at a really fast pace. I've got the hamster wheel is always spinning for me.
Right.
And historically, it's been relatively easy for me to become bored, and I need a lot of stimulation in life. And I don't think I've spent a single minute being bored in this job because it is just incredibly intense. We're under so much pressure. You wake up and you're all over the news, we're in the news every day.
Yeah.
Like getting used to that is like, everything we say is taken very seriously, and you have to learn how to edit and filter and really become very strategic in your messaging. Everything we do is strategic, and Matt and I are similar in that we both have pretty good strategy brains. So we spend a lot of time thinking about how to frame issues, how to be effective. We both care about effective governance. We want to get things done. We're not there to make symbolic statements. We want to actually move the city forward. So I would say a big part of the job, we're decision makers, right? So
Right.
we make decisions on a bewildering number of topics. So an average day, we might be dealing with homelessness and trying to figure out what to do with Tiny Town. Then we're talking about Crystal Pool. Then we're talking about this housing development. Then we're talking about bike lanes and transportation. And then we're talking about like you have to be good at quickly figuring out what is at stake and what is going on in a topic, filtering through a lot of data and information to figure out what's important, and then making really solid decisions. Because we have a lot of authority over everything that goes on in the city. It's a lot. It's hard to get used to, and then all of a sudden people are driving on the other side of the road after to make a decision. So
Yes.
we both take it really seriously and try to make really well-informed decisions for the benefit of everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned how busy you are right now, and obviously we know the climate that we're in. I was wondering what you guys think exactly led to this lack of affordability and availability in the housing market right now in Victoria.
I would start by saying my take on it is undersupply. So I'm a fairly supply-based housing advocate. Meaning I just think that we are in Victoria probably 20,000 units of housing short. There's just fundamentally not enough of it. In British Columbia, maybe I'm making up numbers here, but it could be in the low millions. Across Canada, it's probably a lot higher than that. And so for me, I fundamentally just believe we need to approve more developments to get more supply on the market, and that will bring prices down. Like I'd rather be a renter showing up and looking at 20 vacant units than having 20 people showing up and looking at one vacant unit, that type of thing. So when I look across our communities, whether it be Oak Bay here or Saanich here, I think we just have a massive undersupply of that. And obviously that's been a huge benefit to existing homeowners, right? Keeping supply down, kind of keeping prices very high. And I think people are just kind of figuring it out. They're going like, wait a second, that works for a small group of people, but that doesn't work for a lot of people. And that's where we've seen this. The supply side is one side of it, but I think another piece, I don't know if you want to speak to, is the policy around affordability. It's quite complex.
Yeah, this is a multi-hour conversation, but I also agree that we have a low supply, but Matt and I have somewhat different views in that I'm not a big supply and demand guy. I don't necessarily think that a large supply is going to have an immediate or super impactful impact on affordability, maybe in the long term. But the problem is that Victoria is unique in that it has such a high degree of desirability that people are just going to keep moving here.
Right.
So I think that we do have some unique circumstances that make us a bit different than Saskatoon or someplace like that, where maybe supply and demand is a little bit more applicable. I tend to think of them as somewhat different. We need supply and we need affordability. And to my mind, if they overlap, that's great. But I have lower faith in it happening. So that's why I became the vice chair of the CRHC, because I'm really trying to do as much as I can to advance what I see as true affordability, which is nonprofit housing,
Right.
and also adding supply for supply's sake. And like I say, if they interact, that's great. But to me, there's somewhat separate considerations.
Okay, and would you say that view is shared relatively on the council, or is that more of a thing you look at specifically? Or
I think there's a spectrum of views that go from market truthers to nonprofit housing truthers. That's the spread, and people are along the spectrum. I'm probably a little bit more towards the nonprofit. Matt's probably a little bit more towards the supply, but we can certainly agree that there is a lack of supply.
Right.
It's just about the level of faith you have in it solving the affordability crisis. I think it's maybe a little component, but I think there's several other components.
yeah, absolutely. So what are some things that City Council can do to help improve this issue? Like you mentioned, Matt, improving affordable housing and just improving developments in general, but is it as simple as that, or is it more?
I can speak to the supply side, and then there's a whole bunch of affordability policies that we talked about before the podcast started, but are worth restarting. So, like I'll note, one of the first projects we had in Victoria was the Harris Green project, which was 1,700 or so rental buildings. They're pet friendly. They're
rental units.
Rental, not rental buildings, 1,700 rental units. And, for a lot of people who are renters are really excited about that. Right now, there's almost you can't even find rental units. 1,700 at market rate, whatever that's going to be, is just something that I'm really proud of that we approved that project. I know other councils might not have approved that one. They might have just said, you know what, we don't need those 1,700 units. It's too big, it's too whatever. And I think that would have been a big blow for housing. So one of the things that we're doing in Victoria is adding more units of all types, condos, high-end units, low-end units, and I do believe in filtering. So if we build high-end units, folks that buy those, they sell maybe units that are 20% cheaper and move into those, and then the folks that sell those, the kind of people filter up through the chain. So housing is needed all across the spectrum. So I think Jeremy's been keeping track of how many units of housing have we approved in 1 year so far?
2,900.
About 2,900. And so, I mean, I would encourage you to look at Obey and see, they're probably around 5, 7 houses. So it's which one of those methods do you think is going to be helping with affordability in the housing supply? And I clearly believe, obviously, in our approach. I'm not sure where Saanich and the others are. So that's kind of something that I'm focused on. And I'm also, as much as we're getting 1,700 new units in Harris Green, we're also going to have a really beautifully designed. We're going to get a block. We're getting new bike lanes in there. We're getting all these beautiful water rain gardens. We're getting a huge public plaza in there with art and playground. So not only do we get housing, but it's an opportunity to kind of wipe this old strip mall essentially and build something that really works for the community there. So that's a kind of a bonus feature for me.
Yeah, I mean, there's any number of ways to enter into this question, but I would say one of the things that I've tried to move the city away from, and Matt has as well, is away from the grand bargain. And you're all in the real estate clubs. You probably know what the grand bargain is, but that term came about in the from the late 80s, early 90s. This is an arrangement in Vancouver between neighborhood associations and, let's just say, the single-family home milieu and the city, which said, build whatever you want downtown, just keep your hands off our neighborhoods. And that's why Vancouver kind of looks like Manhattan. And you have these weird situations like you have in Burnaby, where there's like a 60-story tower next to a single-family home. In my mind, that's really, really poor urbanism. And it's spreadsheet urbanism. It doesn't really make sense in context. So I want to get away from this very North American notion that you have to densify in downtown. And that's where Missing Middle came from. Because Missing Middle is, in a sense, an attempt to shift densification away from downtown cores. I don't particularly like tall buildings, but even if you like them or dislike them, there's a lot of people that don't want to live there, especially if people have young kids. There's some people who are willing to, but a lot of people just don't. They feel more comfortable in a townhouse. And so the idea is for us to break down barriers for that missing middle housing type. And we did that in a pretty radical way this year. We had the most permissive missing middle. There wasn't many cities in all of North America that had missing middle at all, which essentially means townhouses, duplexes, triplexes by right, without a rezoning, without public hearing. But our policy went beyond any of those other ones, where you could build up to 6 units on a mid-block property and up to 12 on a corner property if you had 2 units. And so that passed in February or March. Nothing got built for 6 months, and so we radically rethought the policy in October, like last month, and we just rewrote it. We personally rewrote parts of it, and now there's a whole bunch of applications coming down the pike.
Right.
And so it's not just about adding supply. It's about the how and the where and the for whom. There's other questions. It's too simplistic to say, let's just densify.
Right.
I want to densify in a way that aligns with my conception of what sustainable urbanism looks like, and I think the majority of Victorians. And in a lot of ways, it looks like a lot of smaller Western European cities. It looks like Cambridge. It looks like Bordeaux. It looks like Freiburg. It doesn't really look like Vancouver.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, a lot of Victorians do not want us to go on the Vancouver development path.
Right.
They want us to do something that's more authentic to our history, culture, location.
Okay, yeah.
So the hope is that there's lots and lots of those buildings that come in, and it takes the pressure off of the downtown to take all the density.
So when you're looking at everything that's out on the table, how far in advance are you guys thinking and planning? Is it 10 years, 20 years, even shorter than that? Or does it depend on the project?
That's a tough one. We do have an official community plan that looks out about 20 years, but it's very hard to look ahead 20 years, I would say. Like a lot of what we see is, do you want to build this development that's in front of you right now? And so we're kind of thinking in a more of a short-term way. I think Jeremy spoke to how we want to see more density across our neighborhood. So in 20 years, yeah, we are thinking about lots more micro villages. Like I'd like to see kind of villages coming off of UVic and a corner store in every neighborhood, but it's pretty hard to envision what the entire city would look like. Most of the projects that come in front of us, again, like Bayview is going to be another one that you guys might be involved in. It's a 20-acre site in Vic West. It's been derelict for like I think 40 years. And so right now we're just looking at how can we get that project started. It's going to be 1,800 units, so that will be combined with the 1,700 one we approved earlier this year. And I kind of have faith in that. Like I think approving 17 or 1,800 units on it's a really nice design. Largely will probably be a net benefit for the community. But that's the hard part is like where does the rail go in? Where's the transportation? Like it's too much for one individual to think of on their own. So ideally the official community plan should have that, but you could say, we're going to do light rail here, we'll put a train to UVic and all that kind of thing, but then it gets into the reality of, okay, who's going to pay for it and all this type of stuff. So definitely for me, I'm thinking on just how can we get things moving in the next couple of years here.
Right, okay.
With a little bit of a lens on the long-term plan.
But that's a little unfair to all of us because we are thinking a lot about how to have a car light city. Matt and I are both big champions of cycling, walking, transit, and we have agreed to densify the city with people, but not with cars.
Okay.
And parking is a major battle. It's a cultural battle. It's a generational battle, and far too much of our time is taken up by dealing with parking issues. And with all these updates to the OCP and the stuff that's coming from the province, it's finally time to just rip the Band-Aid off and be like, we just need to get rid of parking minimums entirely. Let's put in parking maximums.
Right.
I mean, we had to have a big battle in council to approve a car-free development in Vic West, which was a sixplex, which was just, some people on council just could not wrap their brain. It's like saying you want to live at the bottom of a lake.
Yeah.
You have no parking. It's like, how'd you get around? And and also there's like a lot of bad faith arguments that people will still own cars even if they live in a car-free development. Anyway, that's just one example, but things like bike lanes, but also over on the CRD, I'm on the transportation committee, and one of the things that we're trying to do right now is create a transportation authority.
Right.
And it'll start as a transportation service and then move up to an authority. But the idea is in the next 5 years to have something like a TransLink in Victoria, a corporation owned by the CRD that has jurisdiction, can levy taxes, and we've already started to sketch out what that would look like, and that looks like light rail going up Douglas to the West Shore, and light rail going up Blanchard to YYJ and Swartz Bay. And so I'm really pleased that the province is thinking so much about transit-oriented development because that is long-term thinking. Mm-hmm. I grew up in Seattle, which was a smaller city when I was born and was a bigger city when I was in my 20s, and it didn't plan for its growth. And it ended up with some of the worst traffic in the country. And then retroactively, they went back and started building light rail network, which is great now. But it's like, start that in the 70s or 60s. And that's kind of where we're at in Victoria. It's like, we're at this crossroads right now where we could end up with really poor development patterns unless we think long-term. And things like light rail and transit-oriented development are part of that.
Right. So do you think there's an aspect of almost changing culture with that? You mentioned with the parking-free zones and things, it's simple enough to just put it in, but like you said, people are against it because you mentioned it's like living at the bottom of a lake. Would you say that's one of the harder aspects of your job, is that it's changing people's perception of what they think of the housing market?
In a way, it's almost the easy part because we've kind of, as I mentioned before, we've been caught up in this global wave of like sustainable urbanism where people in cities all around the world are kind of, maybe it's had to do with social media. We're on Instagram, we're on Reddit, we're going, wait a second, look at these like beautifully designed, bike-friendly villages in the Netherlands or in some of these European cities or whatnot. We're going, that's fantastic. Like kids can roam and visit each other, and we're all seeing this now. And I think it's this kind of aha moment for our generation who's been struggling with housing affordability, climate change, and also just livability. Like we don't want to sit in traffic anymore. That's not even socially acceptable really anymore to a lot of people. So we're looking at ways to get around that. So I've actually, I think, quite kind of almost in a way like surfed that wave onto councils. A lot of people in the public were just thinking the exact same thing of like, hey, do you support more bike lanes and support this and that? It's like, absolutely we do. So there is a transformation happening. You're seeing it in a lot of U.S. cities as well, where they're doing missing middle, they're upzoning, they're building bike lanes everywhere. So I really feel fortunate in a way to be part of that, because I think if it was even 10 or 20 years ago, like Victoria Mayor Lisa Helps, who was kind of a visionary in this way around urban development, like she really had to fight against this tide, and not many people really saw where she was coming from there, even though she pushed for this. And in a way, we've had it a bit easy on that way, because even a lot of seniors, like we meet seniors who maybe previously would have been opposed to new housing, and now they're going like, our kids can't find somewhere to live. We think you need more density. We want more kind of missing middle housing, and they're getting on bikes now, going, we don't want to be driving. We want to be biking around, and we have e-bikes. So it seems like everyone's kind of caught up in this right now, and I think it's quite exciting. But maybe you have a different take on it. I don't know.
E-bikes have definitely been a very big game changer in other forms of micromobility, but I do think that there is the boomer generation has, I think, a really hard time letting go of a certain ideal of what a person is supposed to be,
Right.
and what a family is supposed to be, and what a city is supposed to be. And my parents are both, born in 48, 49, and my mother was talking about this the other day. She said, growing up in the 50s, 60s, 70s, everything about our lives revolved around the car. We idolized the car. All of the rock and roll we listened to, most rock songs are about cars. Listen to Bruce Springsteen, it's about cars. And it was a certain conception of modernity that I think a lot of folks have had a really hard time letting go of. And it's just something that passed by Europeans born in the post-war period. It's kind of a uniquely North American thing. So housing policy and zoning are all very technical concretizations of cultural values. And we are a society that values the car, but it values private car ownership. And now with climate change and traffic and densification, it's like we've had to say, well, hold on, maybe this is not working for people anymore. And what comes next? And I think it's, for someone like me or Matt, it's not that hard to figure out what comes next. But for other people who grew up in the 50s, it is actually a lot more difficult, this notion of get an e-bike and a moto. But then we talk to seniors all the time who've done exactly that. They've gotten rid of their car, they do moto, and they have an e-bike, and they get around, they love it, it's cheaper. And there's a lot of people are having this kind of aha moment right now. It's like, we don't need to just completely give our cities over to cars. It's actually horrible for mental health, for kids, for emissions, for everything. Like, I still think that the inundation of the car in cities is a kind of madness. We've gotten used to it, but it's nuts. And it's only, you only see it as nuts if you've spent time in a place like a lot of these Western European cities where cars are marginal to a lot of places. And they have their role, but they're not just like, we haven't just given the keys to the castle to the cars.
Right.
So trying to figure out how to bring people along in that cultural change in a way that doesn't alienate them and we don't piss them off, because we're trying not to piss people off. We're trying to craft a very compelling vision of a better future. That's not that post-war future. That whole image is done. It's done. We need something different.
Yeah, we're far past that.
Like, add on, I think vehicles, when you try to force vehicles into a development, it creates so many challenges. If you have a 100-unit condo and you got to go, okay, well, let's have 100 cars here.
Or 200 cars.
Or 200, yeah, you have a choice. We either dig down to the bedrock, which is incredibly expensive, so the price of those condos that maybe would have been $500,000 is now $1 million because you had to pay for the parking. Or you just say, let's use half the land and we'll just do a big surface parking lot. So if you drive around Gordon Head or some of these places, like half the land is a surface parking lot. So we don't have housing on there. Could have been 4 stick stories of housing instead of it's just a flat level for cars. So we're seeing that more and more where developers are coming forward. There was one on Quadra where they just said, we're going to be car free. And as a result of all those savings, we're going to ideally pass that on to the consumer because we don't have to spend 2 years. There's a JAWL project on Oak Bay Avenue. They spent, by my house, they spent a year and a half just digging the parkade. And I was like, there's been like 20 guys here, concrete trucks for a year and a half. Like, how much did it cost to build that parkage? And so not only are we dealing with what Jeremy's talking about, which is around the urban vision, but cars compete with housing for space and for affordability. And I don't understand why we would force someone to pay for parking if they're not going to have a car. Like, why not offer them an option of, hey, this is the car-free home, and you're going to save a bunch of money, or rather than have a garage, we're going to put in 2 extra bedrooms or a bigger TV room or living room, whatever, and giving people that choice. And I think finally people have, so it's almost a free market thing in a way.
Right.
But also induced demand really is a thing. If you build it, they will come. And if you make it harder to have a car, people go, you know what, maybe I can just get that Moto membership and my e-bike is fine. I mean, for 95% of people, Moto plus e-bike is fine.
Yeah.
You really don't, I mean, if you're in the trades and you need a van, that's different. But for most people, there's obviously some other exceptions, but we want to make it easy and cheap, ideally. We want to make it like a no-brainer to not have a private automobile. Of course, there's always going to be some people who need that. It's fine. But urban planners have not spent a lot of time thinking about this. There's not a lot of urban planners in the 20th century that said, let's create a city where you don't really need a car. Outside of New York or maybe Montreal or places like that, but for the most part, not really around here. But I want to go back to your earlier question about what council can be doing to drive affordability, because we had a little bit of a conversation prior to the podcast that I want to come back to, which is some of the policy mechanisms that we've been testing out in Victoria to drive affordability into market rental and into market home ownership. And to my mind, we've figured out affordable rental in the form of BC Housing, CRHC, other nonprofit housing providers. That works well. We just need a lot more of it. But we haven't really figured out, aside from supply and demand, which at the moment, it's debatable. But aside from that, we haven't really figured out how to get affordable units into market apartments or into condos. And so I want to just talk briefly about some of the things that we've been trying lately.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of the market rental, just a month or two ago, we passed a new policy called the revitalization tax exemption. And what that does is, if you are a market developer, the city will offer you a tax break in the form of the incremental property taxes that would come from rezoning and the improvements to the land. So it's not like all of your property taxes go away, but the differential goes away, because it almost always goes up when there's a rezoning, et cetera. In exchange for agreeing to offer 10% of your units at 15% below market for median household incomes. And it's too soon to say if it worked. It's been like a month. But we've definitely had many conversations with developers who said, yeah, that pencils, we will do that. That's kind of a little bit of a game changer, because we haven't really figured out how to do things like that in a way that pencils, because there's a lot of cool policies that look good on paper, but they don't work in reality. And so it doesn't matter how gorgeous your policy is on paper. It has to work in the real world. So that's something that we're feel optimistic about. On the other side, there's a development on Foul Bay, 902 Foul Bay, that was a very contentious rezoning several years ago, an Arise project, condos. How many units?
Townhomes. Like 15.
18?
Yeah.
And they worked with the CRD. The CRD has this program called, let's just call it an Affordable Homeownership Program, where a developer voluntarily says, we will offer a certain percentage of our units at below market and register it on title, so that even if someone buys it, let's say they're going to be $1 million and below market is $700,000, 5 or 700,000. Even if that person who buys it sells it in 4 years, they would also have to sell it below market. And there might be a little bit of profit, but it's still below market. And that program would be basically managed by the CRD indefinitely. So the developer promised to do 4 units like that. It got rezoned. It was very contentious. Fast forward a year later, interest rates have tripled for developers. They've gone up even higher than they have for you and I, or anyone who owns a home. Their interest rates went from 3% to 9%. All of a sudden, when they're just about to have shovels in the ground, it no longer makes financial sense for them to do this at all. And I had many conversations with the developer. I talked to CRD staff. I talked to City of Victoria staff, and they all told me the same thing, which is that if there's they're technically covenants. If that covenant on the land remained, the project couldn't go ahead. It would actually be foreclosed on. So the developer came back to the city and asked, it's weird because it's managed by the CRD, but technically the city has authority over it. In any case, the developer came back to the city, came back to us and said, hey, will you allow us to remove the covenant on those 4 units and just proceed with all 18 units being marketed? And so Matt and I are like, fuck, like this is one of these things that the public hates.
Right.
They hate it because it was a condition of the rezoning. They sold the neighborhood on these affordable units, and now a year later, it very much looks like a bait and switch. But I happen to believe, talking to all the interested parties and knowledgeable people, the project would have died.
Right.
So we're faced with this impossible decision of looking like we're in the hands of the developers and we're enabling their bait and switch, or we allow a project to die. These are the kind of annoying decisions that we have to make. But the point I'm making here is that when interest rates go up, those nice looking policies all of a sudden don't pencil anymore. So we're frustrated. I think Matt's frustrated too, because we're trying, the CRD, the city, we're trying so hard to figure out how to get affordability into market housing. Mm-hmm. And sometimes things work out and sometimes don't, but when the economy kind of takes a nosedive, all of a sudden those nice to haves go away and then we lose that affordability component.
Right, yeah, absolutely. Well, I'd love to switch it up to the audience. If anyone has any questions. Yeah, here, let me just bring the mic up.
Every one of you has to ask one question. No one's getting off the hook.
You can ask us about things other than housing policy too.
I will ask you about housing policy. I will ask you about some of the new changes that BC has proposed. So just the legislation that was proposed by BC, whether that's Airbnb, whether that's the inclusionary zoning, the transit zoning. Pick one, talk about it. Curious to hear your thoughts.
I'll start on one that I like, which is legislation to establish housing targets. So previously municipalities could get away with just saying, we're full, we're not going to build any more housing. And that was kind of ironic because in many cases they still wanted they wanted the nurses, they wanted people working in there, they wanted some folks there. And so the province gave housing targets to 10 municipalities. Victoria's one, Oak Bay is one, Saanich is one. And I think that's really important to just say, hey, we are growing as a country, we're growing as a province. You can choose how you want to grow, but you have to take some housing on somewhere. So that's going to be the best one. It's kind of ironic because I live on the border of Oak Bay, so I'm in Victoria, who's building a lot of housing. But the municipality right beside me just gets to say, sorry, we don't want any more. And I don't think that's really acceptable for a municipality in this age. So the province has set realistic targets. I can't remember, Oak Bay has a couple of hundred. It includes market condos, rental buildings, and supportive housing. So people who need really low-end rent or have mental health and addiction needs. And I think it's important too that those type of units are distributed. So that's the one I'm most excited about particularly. And then maybe I'll also mention short-term rentals. Previously, you could have a short-term rental in many different places. The province has banned that, so now it has to be in your primary residence. So either maybe you guys renting out a bedroom or something like that. And that's going to bring a lot more units back onto the market. We're already seeing it in Victoria where there was probably about maybe 1,000 short-term rentals. It looks like many of those have already come back on as rental units. So those two are very bold changes that I think if you're a housing advocate, you have to congratulate David Eby on doing something bold, not kind of tinkering around the edges, because we've been tinkering around the edges for a long time and it's clearly not working, and somebody needed to sort of rip the Band-Aid off. And I think those two are pretty exciting, but there's a whole bunch more as well.
Yeah, I plus one to all that, and then I would mention bills 46 and 47. I think they are. 46 is the big one. That if you're a housing nerd, please read Bill 46 because it fundamentally remakes development patterns in BC, and probably the most important thing it will do when it passes next week is that it actually prohibits public hearings for projects that comply with the official community plan. Because public hearings are risky, they slow things down, they are at the whim of politicians and neighbors, and so a lot of it drives up costs. Public hearings are problematic in a lot of ways. The intention was for the public to give input, which is fundamentally a positive thing, I think. But the way they're structured is that they're essentially a decision point. You know, you've gone through years of planning and development work with city staff, and then you get to the public hearing, and the politician's like, we don't like it. It's like, well, maybe you could have told us that like 2 years ago, something. So OCP compliant proposals are now no longer even permitted to go to public hearing. Not that it's optional. Cities are not allowed to do it. That is a massive game changer in our world. If you have an OCP amendment, or if it's not OCP compliant, there still will be public hearings, which is fine. But for the stuff that just complies with OCP, it's just like, council will still approve it, but it doesn't need to go through the whole process. That's a massive change. And then there's other stuff in that bill, but that's one of the big takeaways. And then Bill 47 tries to streamline and rationalize what are called DCCs, which are development cost charges. And right now, there is, again, a lack of predictability for proponents or developers on the amount of DCCs they pay. And DCCs are things like paying for the cost of the sidewalk or the stop lights or the bike lanes that are outside of your development and which your construction will actually affect. It's the underground utilities. It's all the kind of non-sexy stuff that goes into city building. Cities receive these payments from developers. And right now it's a bit chaotic, and there's a lot of bespoke negotiation that goes on between city staff and a developer. And so the intention of that bill is to try to streamline and rationalize and make it more predictable. It's not like the DCCs go away. We really do need these DCCs because density has costs. The development industry kind of hates DCCs, but cities require them. So those are a couple of the changes. And then the short-term rental thing we've been dealing with that for the last month. It's been a lot of emails and intense people speaking at public hearings. And it didn't help that the Minister of Housing mentioned Victoria as pushing the province to change the law on this. And that's what sent a lot of people our way. But definitely some investors are having some struggles right now with investment properties that they bought for Airbnb. But on the whole, I think it's going to be positive, and it's going to add some supply back onto the market pretty quickly.
I just wanted to ask, in terms of the Airbnb policy, what are your thoughts on its potential impacts to the housing market, or sorry, the hotel market? Because if you're theoretically taking Airbnb supply out of Victoria, which again, fantastic thing for people who are looking to rent, it brings supply back onto the market, but it will also, in theory, increase the price of hotels because there's now less options.
Well, can I answer this one?
Yeah.
One of the things that we haven't talked about publicly yet, but I'll just show our cards a little bit here, is that we are talking about loosening our regulations around short-term rental in principal homes. Because the province said you're not allowed to have a short-term rental in non-principal residence, like an investment property. But you're still allowed to have them in a principal residence. But we have additional regulations that clamp down on that precede the provincial law. But now that the provincial law has come, we're kind of looking at our own regs, which we were just in the process of updating and being like, well, maybe we should tweak them now, because those 600 to 1,000 units of essentially hotel rooms are now gone. Maybe some of that can move into private residence or into principal residences, because the main thing is that we don't want to take units off the market. But if we're not taking units off the market, who really cares if people are STRing their principal residence? So there's a good chance we loosen that a bit, and therefore I think a lot of the STRs will switch from non-principal to principal, but there will still be a net loss of them, and we absolutely need new hotels in this town. So we are worried about the impact on tourism.
We need more hotels. I think there's 5 hotel projects in Victoria right now. So one of the nice things is, for me, it gives us a lot more pressure to actually approve those. Because in the past, sometimes councils will go, we don't need another hotel. But we absolutely do. And I know the big study that was used to talk about the impacts of short-term rentals was the McGill study. You might have seen this, and it was actually funded by the Hotel Association. So there's undoubtedly a little bit of politics in there. But at the same time, hotels they provide good jobs, all that kind of stuff. But we need to approve more hotels badly. So 5 more in Victoria sounds like it's probably a great fit for me. And that's a tough one. It's 18,000 units in BC that are going to come back on the rental market. So it's like in politics, there's winners and losers, and we're trying to pick who the winners and who the losers are. Here, maybe the losers might be people paying for hotels, but the winners are locals who are working in hotels, and they're not easy decisions. But we need more hotels. I mean, UVic's a good spot. Could there be a hotel on campus? Probably, right? There's people staying all over the place. So
The model of hotels needs to evolve too, because a lot of people don't want to stay in hotels. I don't like staying in hotels. When I go up island, I stay in an STR because it's more fun. I mean, they're popular because they're awesome, right? It's just that we happen to be in a housing crisis and in which the priority has to be housing. Something had to give a little bit. But I would like to see more innovation in that space, like hotels that maybe function more like STRs, and where there's a kitchen in the room and you can cook your own meals. Like we both have kids. It's extremely expensive for us to travel with children, right? And so my family, we're trying to keep costs down when we travel. We buy our own food, we cook our own food. You can't do that in a lot of hotels. So then you're eating out, and that drives up your costs, and so you don't end up doing the trip. So I'd like to see a lot more innovation in the hotel world, and now have the incentive to do it.
Any other questions?
Everybody has to have a question.
no pressure. Come on.
No pressure.
This is going to be more of a personal one, but would you guys forgo your cars if you were to live in an apartment that didn't have any parking lots?
An interesting question. So I bike full time. My family we have 1 car, but I bike full time. Yeah, the roadblock for me right now is I think for a lot of people it's like the trip, maybe the once in a while camping trip and that kind of thing. And I think moto's kind of come around on that, but yeah, I'd like to get rid of my car. I think my wife is a healthcare worker, so she uses it for healthcare. She drives to client homes. But yeah, I don't know.
I would too. I've had long stretches of my life that I haven't owned a car. My family also owns 1 vehicle right now, an EV, and my wife commutes out to Esquimalt. She works at the clinic there. Trying to get her to get on the bike more, but it's a long haul. I personally bike to and from City Hall and bike around and rarely use a vehicle, but absolutely. I mean, and as Moto or Evo and other car share expands, and with e-bikes, I'm never going back to an acoustic bike, by the way. Done. It becomes a lot easier to rationalize doing it, and it's so much cheaper. Cars are crazy expensive.
It's
It's
challenging for me because I feel like I grew up in the interior in such a car-dominated culture. I'm still like this part of my brain that's like can't let go of it. Like it's a weird generational thing. I'm like, the one time a year I have to go camping, I'll need it for that one time, and it's kind of silly in a way because moto is finally like you could take a moto camping. I think that'll be the kind of last straw for me.
That's where we're going to wrap things up today for our first episode of the Urban Blueprint. Thank you all for listening, and we hope you're able to learn something today from our guests. Another huge thank you to Jeremy and Matt for joining us today. We're so grateful they took their time out of their day to get a chance to share what they know with you guys. So keep an eye out for our next podcast, and make sure you follow the podcast to ensure you don't miss out. Good night, everyone.